The tail strike you have just seen was not generated in some computer someplace to give us an interesting way to open this video. It actually happened to one of these MD-90s during certification tests down at our flight test center at Yuma, Arizona, which explains how we happened to have a camera playing on the airplane at the time. We'll come back to that sequence again a little later in this video. The Douglas Flight Operations Department has recently completed a review of a number of transport tail strike events. The purpose of this study was to help us to understand the tail strike phenomenon better, and perhaps to see if there was some characteristic in the airplane or some technique or procedure in use by the flight crew that makes it more likely that they'll strike the tail. In the study, we reviewed the actual flight recorded data on a number of actual tail strikes. And this video is a report of what we found out. For openers, it's probably safe to say that all transport class aircraft are somewhat vulnerable to striking the tail. The physical geometry of the airplane, and particularly the length of the fuselage, puts the tail at risk. We learned in our study that tail strikes occur in good weather and in bad, during the daytime as well as at night, and more or less equally during the takeoff and landing phases of flight. This is an area where the model aircraft may make a difference. It does appear that some models are more susceptible to striking the tail on takeoff and others on landing. We also learned, perhaps not surprisingly, that pilot experience plays an important role. Pilots transitioning to a new aircraft type, as a group, they appeared in our statistics a lot more often than any other pilot group. We learned that there are 8 factors, we'll call them risk factors, which kept recurring in the flight recorded data. 4 on takeoff and 4 on landing. Now, these may not be the only 8. You may be aware of others. But we know for a fact that each one of these played some significant role in a recent transport tail strike event. So I'd like to review each of the 8, and where appropriate, I'll bring in a scenario, a typical scenario of how such an event may cause a tail strike. In discussing the takeoff risk factors, I'd like to begin by looking at a mistrimmed stabilizer. Probably every pilot who views this video can remember at least one takeoff in which, after the airplane got airborne, he or she was aware that the stabilizer was really not properly set. If the stabilizer is mistrimmed nose down, then as the aircraft accelerates to rotation speed, it will require a greater pull force on the elevator than is usual, and the aircraft may respond sluggishly. If the aircraft is mistrimmed in the nose up direction, however, the aircraft will require less pull force than the pilot is accustomed to, and he may be surprised to see how quickly the nose lifts off the runway and how rapidly the aircraft rotates thereafter. You may recall that we recommend a rotation rate of 2.5 or 3 degrees per second. In this case, the pilot could see a rotation rate of 5 degrees per second or more, and in just a couple of seconds could rotate the aircraft to a point where the tail could be at risk. Even worse, if the stabilizer is substantially mistrimmed, nose up, then the nose may try to fly from the runway by itself. As the aircraft accelerates to VR, or perhaps even as early as V1, the nose may ride light on the runway, there may be a couple of light bounces, and the nose will lift off the runway by itself. And the rotation rate that occurs thereafter will be faster than the pilot is accustomed to seeing. Now, usually, the aircraft will lift off at a pitch attitude of about 8 degrees. But in this case, because the rotation occurred early, the aircraft will probably not have sufficient forward velocity to generate the lift to fly off the runway. So the airplane will remain on the runway, and unless the pilot actively intercedes, the rotation will continue. Then the aircraft is likely to lift from the runway at a pitch attitude of 10 or 11 degrees, and the tail will brush the runway on liftoff, or more likely strike the runway several seconds after becoming airborne. How does a pilot find himself in a situation where the stabilizer is mistrimmed? Well, usually it's because of some error that was made in the computations on the load sheet. Perhaps the flight dispatcher received some misinformation, or maybe made some mathematical error, or the information that was provided to the flight crew was correct, but the flight crew just set the stabilizer incorrectly. In any case, it points up the real importance of carefully looking at the numbers on the load sheet, particularly the takeoff gross weight, the zero fuel weight CG, and the takeoff CG. After we've made a few takeoffs in this weight range, we know about where the center of gravity usually lies and approximately where the stabilizer trim should be set. So check those numbers for reasonableness and make sure that they make sense. And do that before you take the runway, so that you won't encounter a situation in which the aircraft tries to rotate off the runway by itself. A second takeoff risk factor might be rotating the aircraft at the wrong speed, either rotating before the airplane reaches VR or rotating at a VR speed which itself is wrong. In a recent case of rotating before reaching VR, the aircraft was going out heavy on a rather short runway. It was a runway length limited takeoff. And because of the heavy weight, the crew used a reduced flap setting for takeoff, which produced takeoff reference speeds which were somewhat higher than what they're accustomed to seeing. In addition, a reduced flap setting for takeoff does reduce also the tail clearance a bit on rotation. In this case, the aircraft accelerated on the runway to VR, and as the airplane approached VR, the pilot, perhaps concerned about how much runway was remaining, began lightening up the nose. The aircraft rotated prior to reaching VR and brushed the tail as it lifted off the runway at about 10 degrees. In the second case of rotating at a VR speed which itself is wrong, this is almost always the result of an incorrect takeoff gross weight being entered. In one recent case we saw, the pilot entered a takeoff gross weight that was 100,000 pounds lower than aircraft actual weight. This naturally generated a rotation speed that was about 12 knots low. The aircraft was rotated at that low speed and of course did not lift off at the normal liftoff point. It did come off the runway at about 10 degrees and struck the tail during rotation. So again, it stresses the importance of looking at the load sheet and making sure that the numbers are correct and that they are reasonable for the existing condition. A third factor on takeoff might be excessive pitch attitude or excessive pitch rate. With respect to pitch attitude, that would be the attitude at which your tail would strike the runway. That varies a little bit from aircraft to aircraft, but generally falls in the 9 degrees to 13 degrees of nose up. The number for the airplane that you fly can be found in your operations manual. And even that number has some variables in it depending upon strut servicing, on tire inflation, and on the rate of rotation. A very vigorous rotation can place compression loads on the struts, which will reduce the tail clearance somewhat. Excessive pitch rate can be the result of simply a too aggressive nose-up pull force, or it could be related to the aircraft's center of gravity. Recall that when the center of gravity is well aft, particularly when it approaches the aft limits, then the aircraft can be expected to be more sensitive in pitch. That's true through all regimes of flight and is also true on takeoff. So even if the takeoff weights are correct and the takeoff speeds are correct and the stabilizer is properly set, still the aircraft can be expected to be quite sensitive during rotation to pitch change. And the flight crew should be aware as they take the runway of where the center of gravity is located and anticipate this pitch sensitivity. The last of the takeoff risk factors deals with the use of the flight director, or more specifically, the inappropriate use of the flight director. You may recall that the flight director was not certified nor ever intended to be used during the takeoff or during rotation. It provides accurate pitch guidance only after the aircraft is airborne. In most aircraft, the pitch bar is biased up to some value well above the horizon during the takeoff roll, essentially to get it out of the way so that the flight crew can more accurately view their pitch rate during rotation. It provides accurate information only after the aircraft is in the air. Recall that if you rotate at 2.5 or 3 degrees per second, the airplane lifts off the runway at about 8 degrees, and the rotation rate continues thereafter. The aircraft will pass through the 35-foot point with a pitch attitude of about 15 degrees and a speed of V2 plus 10, and that is our aiming point. Moving into the landing risk factors, perhaps the unstable approach occurred more often than any other. In fact, in the flight recorded data, it appeared in virtually every landing tail strike. The classic scenario is that the aircraft gets turned into final approach with too much airspeed, too much altitude, or some combination thereof. And the pilot spends the remainder of the approach trying to dissipate that extra energy. You may recall that we aim for 1,000 feet above the ground as a point where conditions should be stable. That is, the aircraft should be on the localizer, on the glide slope or the visual approach path, on speed, and in the final landing configuration. Now, we realize that's not always possible at 1,000, but by the time the airplane descends to 500, if these factors are not stable, we recommend that the pilot execute a go-around every time. What we have found is that if the pilot presses on in the approach from that unstable position, in the recorded data it shows rather large and abrupt power and pitch changes in the latter part of the approach. When the aircraft arrives in the flare, it invariably has either too much airspeed or not enough, and quite often the airplane is long on the runway. That is, it has taken some extra room to dissipate that energy, and the aircraft has moved down the runway to a point where perhaps the pilot is concerned about whether he has enough runway remaining to get the aircraft on the ground and get it stopped. For whatever reason, we see in the flare some rather abrupt pitch changes, and often culminating in one last vigorous nose-up pull just prior to touchdown. This frequently rotates the airplane into the runway, the main landing gear contacting the runway while the nose is coming up rather rapidly. And unless the pilot actively intercedes at that point to limit the pitch attitude, the aircraft is likely to keep right on rotating until the tail strikes. Bear in mind also that on touchdown, with main gear spin up, the ground spoilers deploy. When they do, the lift pattern on the wing changes and the center of lift moves forward, adding yet another mild additional nose-up pitching force to those that already exist. A second risk factor during the landing would be trimming the aircraft in the flare. We know that pilots are trained to trim the airplane throughout the flight and through the approach, which is appropriate. But when the aircraft arrives in the flare, trimming is risky. What we find is that it's easy to over-control the trim, or perhaps to over-control the elevator when the stabilizer has been retrimmed, and accidentally stop the rate of descent completely, sometimes at a point 10, 15, 20 feet above the runway. When that occurs, just as the aircraft is entering the ground effect, the airplane may enter into a long float period above the runway while airspeed bleeds off, sometimes from VREF to VREF minus 5, minus 10, even 15 knots below VREF before the energy plays out and the airplane begins to fall. Now, if the aircraft is only a foot or two above the ground, the pilot may get away with it. But if the airplane is 12 or 15 feet above the ground, then as it settles, there's a great tendency for us to pull to try to salvage the landing by rotating the nose up and possibly driving the tail into the ground. The crosswind approach has many elements in it that increase the risk of striking the tail. Let me set up a scenario where the aircraft is flying an approach into a strong direct crosswind, 90 degrees at 20 or 25 knots. On this approach, the aircraft is established in final with the correct amount of crab so that the aircraft is tracking directly down the extended runway centerline of the runway. Several things may become immediately apparent. One is that the ground speed is rather high. The closure rate on the runway is more rapid than perhaps the crew is accustomed to seeing, this because there's no headwind component to the existing wind. In addition, at this high ground speed, it's necessary to maintain a higher than usual rate of descent, perhaps 7, 8, even 900 feet per minute. And in order to keep the aircraft from accelerating on the glide slope, the thrust is likely to be well back, approaching idle in some cases. Now, into this situation, the pilot descends through 150 to 200 feet and applies the crosswind correction, the forward slip maneuver, where he applies rudder to line up the fuselage with the runway centerline, simultaneously lowering the upwind wing to compensate for the tendency for the aircraft to drift. The forward slip maneuver, by definition, results in a cross-controlled condition. Rudder in one direction, aileron in the other, invariably results in a loss of lift and an increase in drag. And it begins a subtle increase in sink rate at this point, which is already on top of a rather high descent rate. This may not be apparent until the aircraft approaches the flare. With the power manually spooled back, or with the auto throttles in use and the auto throttles in the retard mode, then a quick application of thrust may not be immediately available to check the rate of descent. Now let me throw in one more curveball, and that is the wind. We have all seen cases in which, when the aircraft descends through about 100 feet, the effects of the wind begin to play out. And that 90-degree crosswind, in the worst scenario, may in fact roll back to a quartering tailwind. And the velocity may change, resulting in a net loss of lift at a critical moment in the flare. All of the above may tend to come together in the last 10 seconds of flight, and the pilot may get the sensation that the bottom is falling out. There is then this inclination to try to recover by pulling back briskly on the yoke. Let's look at that just a moment. When you apply a vigorous nose-up pull in the flare, you in fact download the tail, and the wing reads that as increasing aircraft weight. The airplane essentially just got heavier. In this case now, in order to check the rate of descent, additional lift would be required, and the additional lift is simply not available. The aircraft may rotate nose up, it will not check the descent rate, and in fact may actually increase the rate of descent and place the tail at risk. So crosswind approaches require special care in controlling the descent rate and in controlling thrust to ensure that thrust is available to help if the descent rate increases. The last of the landing risk factors is really a go-around risk factor. It is possible on a very low altitude go-around to strike the tail on the go. You recall that the flight director will provide pitch guidance during the go-around, and thrust will be added to ensure a normal flight path. However, it is also possible to rotate the aircraft so aggressively into the pitch bar, and if the thrust response is not fast enough, end up in a nose-high condition where the tail is at risk. In summary, let's review the lessons we've learned from actual tail strike events which have occurred in the past. A mistrimmed stabilizer, errors in the takeoff weight or CG can produce an error in the stabilizer trim setting that will set the stage for a tail strike on rotation. Rotation before VR, or rotating at a VR which itself is wrong because the wrong takeoff weight is used, places the tail at risk. Rotating at an excessive pitch rate, especially when the CG is aft, can bump the tail. Using the flight director pitch bar as a target during rotation can pull the nose up so rapidly that the tail hits. Unstable approach, chasing airspeed and altitude with excessive pitch and power changes is the greatest single cause of tail strikes. Trimming in the flare, or any other pilot technique that produces a long floating hold-off, sets the stage for a last-minute drop-in touchdown, the second most common tail striker. Crosswind approaches, especially with gusty, quartering tailwinds, may create a high sink rate late in the flare. A last-minute pull may drive the tail into the ground. And finally, a go-around occurring very late in the approach. Following the flight director pitch commands must be carefully tempered to coincide with increasing thrust to ensure that a safe attitude is maintained. In closing, if we carried away one important message from our study, it's that we need to enhance our sense of situational awareness, particularly our attitude awareness, when we're operating on or near the ground. And this is especially true when we're transitioning to a new aircraft type, when we're still developing our visual sense of attitude and height above the runway. At the risk of belaboring the obvious, tail strikes occur only when the nose gets too high. It's as simple as that. What you must do is enhance your sense of attitude awareness when operating near the ground to ensure that it doesn't happen to you.